What is God really like? Some people think the most important question of life is, do you believe in God? But a more important question is, what kind of God do you believe in? In preparing for today's homily, I reread the wonderful book by Henry Nouwen entitled The Return of the Prodigal Son. And Nouwen, when he wrote it, was completely taken aback by the painting of this parable by the famous painter Rembrandt. And what struck me most was this insightful comment. He says, for years I instructed students on the different aspects of the spiritual life, trying to help them see the importance of living it. But had I myself really ever dared to step into the center, kneel down, and let myself be held by a forgiving God? Most people like the story we just heard because we identify in some way with the prodigal son. The need to leave home, to find ourselves. And often in the process, we get off track, wander down some really dark and scary alleys. And as I've often told myself, only by the grace of God am I here today. Sometimes we're asked to swallow something more tasteless than corn cobs, our pride, before we come to our senses and head home with contrite hearts. But then we come to the climax of this parable. While he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was filled with compassion. He ran to his son, embraced him, kissed him. No patriarch would ever be the first to rise and go toward someone younger. They would wait, sitting, and to receive the other's homage. But the father in this parable is different. He doesn't ask himself, shall I let him in or send him back? Or what conditions should I set? Which honestly, I would be tempted to do if it was my son. That's why many would say that this story is not really about a prodigal son, but about a merciful, loving, compassionate God. Personally, it'd be a lot easier if the story ended right here, but it doesn't. As a hyper-responsible, oldest child, I identify with the elder son. So when the father decides to throw a homecoming bash for his lost son, my heart goes out to the elder brother. The older son gets no party, no fatted calf, no ruby ring. Instead, his dad comes out with a few words for his sulking son. You are always with me, and all that I have is yours. It might be nice to imagine that the father's words console the elder son or convince him to join the party. But I'm not so sure. And honestly, this little speech is pretty lame. It reflects a father's point of view, not that of a dutiful son. It's easy for me to imagine the elder son's anguish stretching into weeks, months, maybe even years. So the real story of forgiveness, at least for me, in this parable comes when we focus on the older son. He too must forgive, not only his brother, but his father as well. Now, this contention may make little sense if we only think of forgiveness as receiving pardon for violating a rule or a precept. Because the younger brother did nothing to harm his elder sibling, and nor did the father's joy and spontaneous merrymaking at his lost son's reappearance mean that he loved the elder brother any less. So what's really going on here? Well, I am the oldest of 6. I left home over 30 years ago, hard to believe, and moved 3,000 miles away. So my next oldest brother, Andrew, is for all practical purposes the eldest son. Until I come home, of course. He lives the closest to my parents, always there to help my dad shovel the snow, watch the house when they go on vacation. And my parents have been very generous to him and his family over the years, and I'm actually very grateful that he lives that close. But there's always been for my brother an underlying hurt, not feeling the love. I can't rationally explain it. A couple of weeks ago, we were talking on the phone, and the topic came up about my parents driving all the way to Brooklyn once a week to babysit for my youngest brother's kids. I don't know what triggered it, but here we are in our 50s, and I still hear him talking about those feelings of resentment because my parents never babysat his kids, and boy, is my youngest brother spoiled. Why didn't they ever offer that to me, even though he admits he never asked for it? How difficult is it for any of us to return to God when we're caught up in jealousy or imprisoned in obedience and duty? Or when we're so ensnared in our own self-righteous complaints that we are doomed to remain outside the house, wallowing in our anger and resentment? In a world that constantly compares people, ranking them as more or less intelligent, more or less attractive, more or less successful, it's not easy to really believe in a love that does not do the same. Can the elder son in you and in me come home? I recently read something that helped clarify and deepen my understanding of forgiveness. It says forgiveness means relinquishment. To relinquish something is to release whatever power it holds over us. How often do we say we forgive another person, but still hold that secret grudge? I think this is why Jesus told his students to forgive 70 times 7. Because true forgiveness comes only at the end of an inner struggle. And if we view forgiveness in this light, perhaps we can see why it's necessary for the elder brother to forgive, but why it'll also be extremely difficult. As long as he regards himself as slighted, that notion will worm its way into his soul and embitter him and make his life a living hell. And it hardly matters whether the injustices are real or imagined. So if we need a reason to forgive, this is a good one. We forgive to be free, to be liberated from the destructive power of anger and resentment. I found this wonderful quote by a German theologian. I won't even attempt to pronounce his name. It says, "Love proves its authenticity in fidelity, but reaches its completion in forgiveness." This profound truth applies not only to human love, but also to God's love. God's love proves its authenticity and fidelity, but it finds its completion in forgiveness because God is most divine when forgiving. God's love is based on nothing, sets no conditions, and in this forgiveness we can experience a wonderful truth, and that love can change us. Resentment and gratitude cannot coexist. We heard today St. Paul say, "Whoever is in Christ is a new creation," because reconciliation is a power to begin anew. So we must recognize that we are lost, but we also have to recognize and be prepared to be found and to be brought home. I've struggled most of my life to find God, to know God, and to love God. And yet, in light of today's gospel, I wonder whether part of my problem is not realizing all this time that God has been trying to find me, to love me, and to know me. And this radically changes the character of my spiritual journey when I no longer think of God as hiding out and making it difficult for me to find. The question is not, how am I to find God? But how am I to let myself be found by God? And what can I do to make this return possible? What kind of God do I believe in? A God who meets us halfway and says, "Welcome home."